So next up, you're going to hear from Pat Kelly, president of the Whistler Real Estate Company. Pat has been active in the real estate business in Whistler and Pemberton since 1981. He's a graduate of the Commerce program at the University of BC and holds a master's degree in legal studies from Simon Fraser University. He's also a member of the Real Estate Institute of BC and Canada. Pat's been the sole owner of the Whistler Real Estate Company Limited since 1999. He's an active volunteer and takes part in as many recreational activities as his time, and he did write this. He's been having a bit. This is the year of your reality check. As much as his time and aging body will allow. So if you just want to creak on up here, Pat, we'll hear from Old Man Kelly.
I can make this a lot shorter. Thanks for being here today. Thanks, Mo. Let me just make sure I understand how this thing works. There we go. You already heard who I am. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the real estate market here in the corridor, focusing on Squamish, Whistler, and Pemberton. And what I'd like you to take away from this is that what I have found historically is that there's an awful lot of hearsay about real estate markets. Valuations seem to take place at cocktail parties, and nobody really looks at data. So I'm hoping you will go away from this with a little bit of understanding, better understanding of what's been going on up and down the corridor. There we go. Squamish, Whistler, and Pemberton are different marketplaces. Quite frankly, the Squamish and Pemberton are typical small towns. Their real estate markets are driven by local economies. They're driven by income levels. They're driven by population growth. Whistler, on the other hand, is largely driven by external economic factors, tourism trends, perception of experience at the resort, and the quality of the amenities, as well as discretionary spending trends. So psychology and confidence become very much a part of the purchase decision in Whistler. Subsequently, Whistler doesn't follow the trends that you might see in a standard residential housing market, particularly when the market turns down. It can be very buoyant and aggressive when it's going up, but when it turns down, it tends to, what I used to refer to as downward sticky. It doesn't react because of a lack of urgency by most of the owners in the marketplace. Over the last little while, Squamish has clearly demonstrated a much closer link to what's driving the Vancouver real estate market. In 2013, all of a sudden, I think a whole bunch of people realized that the Squamish marketplace was very good value as compared to the prices in Burnaby or Surrey, and that the lifestyle provided by Squamish was a good deal more attractive than those places. And there was a huge uptick in activity into the Squamish marketplace, which was subsequently followed by big name developers moving into the community and developing an extensive amount of density and residential housing. Apparently I can't turn my head down like that. That doesn't work well. They all affect each other, however. When Pemberton, for instance, if Whistler is developing or initiating a resident housing program, of which we've done a very good job of, the resulting success of that program impacts rental vacancy in both Pemberton and Squamish, as well as the resale housing markets, because their first choice of most of their labor force is to be as close to their jobs as possible. And so we did see historically that when Cheakamus Crossing and Rainbow came on the market, the real estate market in Pemberton was impacted in a negative manner. Also, both of those communities are growing dramatically, and for anybody that's traveled the highway in the last 2 or 3 years, you've probably noticed that traffic is a little heavier, and part of that component is the fact that Squamish is developing its own tourist identity, and day tripping to Squamish has now become a thing. 10 years ago, I don't know that there would be a lot of people you would have talked to who have said, well, I think I'm just going to go up to the Sea to Sky Gondola and then I'm going to go home. There is a whole group of people that are making Squamish a very vibrant community right now, and driving it and creating business opportunity. That being said, these markets have reacted very much the same since 2011. Rapid growth, constrained only by opportunity. It's interesting to note that the Whistler market actually moved into a growth curve before Squamish and Pemberton. And I think that's likely due to the fact that interest rates, and Helmut will correct me if I'm wrong here, interest rates probably were at their lows in 2013 and 2014. Access to capital improved dramatically at that period. and allowing both homeowners and investors to start to participate in the real estate markets in a more active manner. Whistler reacted a little bit differently and actually came out of the Olympics in a very strong manner and grew steadily right through until just recently. These are median prices for properties in the corridor. As you can see, they've all gone up, other than a few little bumps along the way. Generally speaking, anybody that's owned a home in this area for the last 4 or 5 years is certainly feeling good about themselves, I would think. One of the things to keep in mind is these are small markets. Last year, the Squamish market did a little under 800 transactions. Whistler did a little under 700. Pemberton did about 200. So there can be extreme volatility. Trying to apply the general trends to specific situations can be problematic. I think every market is driven by its own unique characteristics. And I think you need to be aware of the fact that if you're looking at a single-family house in Whistler or in Squamish, that it may be different in terms of its performance than what this general data might indicate. Also, some of the definitions between communities aren't really the same. So we like to think that this is a general wave top overview as compared to a specific your house is worth $1 million type of discussion. Here we can see what's happened in Squamish. As I say, up until about 2013, the market traded on its population growth. And then in 2013, we saw a big uptick in interest, particularly coming out of the Vancouver marketplace. Drove volumes to very high levels historically, much above, very much above their historical, what we would expect to see historically as a normal growth curve. And then recently, based on some of the issues that Helmut raised, we saw a drop off in activity. Most of that is related to stress tests and interest rate increases, not to lack of product. There is no shortage of new homes coming in Squamish. Median price, again, the relative value of the Squamish market compared to Vancouver, where the bulk of the new buyers and population growth was coming from, fueled a rapid increase in prices, which was above and beyond the incomes that were being generated or the wealth that was generated in the Squamish marketplace. That influx of new capital and higher wage levels fueled an increase in prices. At one point, a house in North Vancouver was $1.5 million, and a similar house in Squamish was $750,000. It certainly motivated some people to move. That trend continues today, and I would expect that any large correction is unlikely. These new levels of pricing is probably going to be where we're at in Squamish. Again, you can see that property owners in Squamish have been happy. I'm not sure they're happy when they get their tax assessment notices, but they're certainly happy. Current situation, the inventory has come off an all-time low and is increasing slowly. Days on the market for sellers is extending. Buyers are certainly got more choice at the current time. There is a significant amount of new construction in process. Roughly 900 units are under construction and expected to be completed in the next 12 to 18 months. Most of that is pre-sold, much of it to investors. Given that their ability to flip those units may be a bit restricted going forward, they may have some impact on the rental market in Squamish in terms of availability and rates. There's also several rental-specific projects on the go in Squamish right now, one to house all the workers for the LNG project. Additionally, there's another 900 units that are approved and are going to probably enter in construction in the next 12 months, combined with some very large projects that are multi-year projects, which will provide close to another 5,000 properties in the Squamish area in the foreseeable future. That sounds like a lot. And certainly if you drive around down there, you say, oh my God, what's going on? But the expectations for population growth in Squamish are that it'll go from its current level of 20,000 to 40,000 people within the next 20 years. So this inventory probably won't even be enough to satisfy that demand as Squamish grows. You see the median prices there, a little lower than Vancouver. The average price per square foot is for medium density construction. Obviously there's a range on that, and it can be a little bit higher. The commercial industrial situation in Squamish, lease rates, ground floor, $20 to $40 a foot, triple net. Industrial, $20 to $25. there are more people interested in renting space than there currently is space available. And I expect that that will continue to be the case as the resident population of Squamish continues to grow. Their OCP is now complete. They've continued actualization of all of their approved projects and are starting on new projects. They did have very much of a focus on brownfield development in Squamish. I think if you drive around downtown now, you'll notice that most of those empty lots now have buildings going up on them. There is development going south and north in Britannia. If you look right just before you head up the hill, you'll notice there's quite a big mixed-use project going in. Looking to take advantage, I would expect, on the day travel going up and down the highway. They call it the Galileo coffee effect. Garibaldi at Squamish, I know most of us in this room haven't heard much about it recently, but it is definitely moving forward. And it does have support, I believe, of the Squamish Nation and support at the district level. So whereas that was a project that may have fallen off your radar, expect to start hearing more about that going forward, and that is also a significant residential development. As I said, Squamish in the last decade was the fastest growing non-urban community in BC. Whistler was second, in case you were interested, and is expected to grow to 40,000 people going forward. However, all that rapid growth doesn't come without its challenges. And there's certainly issues to do with community services, traffic flow. Anybody tried to get out on Highway 99 at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon at Cleveland Avenue knows that that's a long wait. And so traffic flow, amenities, parks. My daughter works for the district, and she was telling me that the Brennan Park Sports Facility is the most used sports facility in British Columbia. And it is about 30 years old. So they have some growth management issues that they need to address going forward, and I expect that's where they will start to focus more than on residential growth. I think you got to think about the impact of all that ongoing construction on the marketplace. Certainly combining it with some of the macroeconomic features, there may be a lot more choice out there, and that usually tends to bring prices down a little bit if there's a lot of urgency on the part of buyers. The LNG plant that's going in there is a huge game changer for Squamish. That's 5 years of massive construction and will certainly perhaps pick up some of the real estate that is going to be available here in the short order. And the growth of local tourism. Sea to Sky Gondola was probably the trigger, but from that has grown a huge amount of tourism-related businesses in the Squamish area, ranging from biking to craft beer to art, and they are taking on their own identity there. Beautiful Pemberton, town of 2,000 people, one road, one street light, 2 stop signs. However, the curve, well, you have a stop sign outside your house, don't you? Yeah, okay. You're one of the lucky ones. As you can see, the rate of real estate sales, very similar to Squamish's. Again, it was related to ease of capital, ease of access to capital, lower interest rates allowing people to enter into the marketplace. When we look at prices, they're banded a little bit more by the fact that this is a market that doesn't have the incomes that you might see in Squamish and Whistler, so people can't afford the higher prices that we would see in those other communities. That being said, prices have certainly gone up, and it continues to be the least expensive place to buy in the corridor. Current situation. Lots of interest from builders and developers to build. I've personally reviewed a couple of projects just recently, and so well, that's a lot of units. It's very attractive to young families looking for affordable housing and recreational enthusiasts who are looking to either get off the grid or looking to have easier access to the backcountry. The other big trend we're seeing is a lot of empty nesters and downsizers, which is a trend in British Columbia, people moving out of the cities into smaller towns, into more affordable locations and away from the urban environment. And we're certainly seeing more of that in the Pemberton area. Also, grandparents wanting to be closer to their grandkids, because these are the communities that their grandkids can afford to live in. Density, you can see the prices there, pretty much the lowest in the corridor. The industrial park has had a flurry of activity over the last year and a half. It's all purpose-built. There is no proven leasing market in the industrial park in Pemberton, but we didn't know that from all the buildings that are going up. I think that's partly due to the fact that it's impossible to actually own a piece of industrial land in either Pemberton or Squamish right now. You're either a landlord or you're a tenant. You can't be the owner of your own business on that site. So that's created a lot of activity, and prices have risen accordingly. Commercial situation, much like Squamish, there's people that would like to open businesses in Pemberton, but there's no space to open them. Or the spaces that are available are being operated by landlords that are somewhat indifferent to the market realities, or the space just isn't appropriate for the ideas people have. Certainly there's some opportunity with our population growth to have some more businesses open in the Pemberton community. And there have been. You know, we have a couple of craft breweries open now, some bike shops. There's some other things happening there that are part of the influx of people over the last 3 or 4 years. One thing to keep in mind, the Village of Pemberton is strongly impacted by the ALR. Growth in the community is directed by the ALR considerations primarily. And I think you have to sort of, when you look around at what's going on, and you say, well, where is it? It's actually up on the hillsides, which is more expensive to develop. Finally, Whistler. As I said, the growth in Whistler started far earlier than it did in Squamish and Pemberton, basically coming right out of the Olympics. And I put that down to the success of the community to continue to lever the Olympics and expose us, to expose the community to more tourism. I think the establishment of the community as a legitimate four-season resort brought more people into the community and more interest in owning real estate here. At the same time, we don't have a lot of new product, so that tended to drive prices fairly quickly to the point, until we got to the point where there was nothing left to sell. And so when you see that drop off in activity, that's more related to the fact that we were down to probably the fewest number of listings in the community that we've ever had in my 38 years. And so it wasn't that there weren't people that wanted to buy things. The problem was they couldn't find anything to buy, and they certainly couldn't find what they wanted. And this is, for 80% of the people that buy here, a discretionary purchase. They're not going to buy something less than what they really would like to aspire to. Now you're seeing in 2018 the prices are starting to, the values are starting to moderate a little bit. As Helmut said, there isn't much chance that you're going to get double-digit appreciation for a long period of time. But historically, Whistler prices do go up and go up at a better rate than residential markets. Dollar volume of sales is somewhat logical, or it should make sense of the fact that if unit volume falls, dollar volume falls. Not telling yourself anything new. The one line to look at there is the red line. That is townhouse sales. And despite the fact that townhouse sales, there we go, townhouse sales in this fell, the total value of sales went up. Townhouses have been the highest and best performing sector of our marketplace over the last 5 years. Median prices, again, pretty much other than the 2008 period, and I will say that line there, the gray line, please ignore that one. We sell less than 20 lots a year, and so the volatility associated with pricing and lots is a direct function of what's actually for sale. So if really expensive lots are for sale, great, they sell. If really cheap lots are for sale, they sell. But it doesn't actually indicate average pricing. You can see that condos, townhouses, and single-family homes have risen dramatically. Again, your assessments probably told you that this year. Long-term owners are particularly happy. I always like to bring this into the story a little bit, only because I think, well, it's a question we get asked a lot, is where do we stand relative to our peer group? I think it's important to point out that Eagle County, Summit County, and Park City do 3 times as much real estate activity as we do. They're very large markets. They do over $2 billion a year in sales and close to 2,700 transactions. We do 650. So they are different. They have communities within their counties, and perhaps it's better to compare to communities. So if we look at the Vale area, which is Vale Village, and I'm not sure of all the areas, I haven't been to them all, but Vale currently, so you know, Whistler, for your comparison point, I've converted to US dollars. Dollars per square foot in Whistler right now is running around $850 US. Housing transaction, the average transaction value is around $1 million, $950,000 to $1 million is the average transaction value for a piece of real estate in this area. In Vail, the average price of a single family home, $2,150 a square foot. Townhouses sell at $1,700 a square foot. Beaver Creek, $850, more comparable to us. Bachelor Gulch, $900 a foot or more. Those are all ski-in, ski-out communities. When you move away from those areas, however, the dollar per square foot drops dramatically. That is due to proximity. They're not as close to the ski hills, and they're a little older, and they drop down to $500 and $600 a square foot. Summit County, Breckenridge is probably the closest to us at around $975,000 on the average transaction. Keystone comes in at $640. The average for the Summit County area is around $770,000 US. You go to Park City, Old Town is probably as close a comparison as there is to Whistler. Their prices are very similar to ours. A little bit of an anecdote, some of you may have noticed in the paper that the community just negotiated a deal to purchase a piece of land called the Prism Lands for some community benefits. Last year, Park City, over concerns related to overdevelopment, purchased 104 acres that was slated for $1 million square feet of commercial and residential development for $64 million. So it looks like the deal that our current council made was a pretty good one. Jack paid me to say that. And Aspen is a world to itself. It is a very small market. And the average price of a home in Aspen currently is running at $6.9 million. That is down from $8 million. They had a bad year. The average condo price in Aspen is $2.67 million US. However, Snowmass reverts back to the $500 to $600 a foot range. So I guess the takeaways that I would offer you is all of these markets experienced much the same as we did, slowing in activity but support for prices, and that our prime properties, our best properties in Whistler, continue to be good value and continue to compare favorably with our peers. Whistler, basically, 50% of the market is below $1 million, 50% of the market is above $1 million. But that's going to change going forward. I would expect we'll see a greater percentage of our transactions will occur above $1 million in the future. Market composition, most of the activity is in medium density. That shouldn't surprise anybody that's been here for any amount of time because most of the town is medium density. However, all the value is in the family-oriented real estate, chalets and townhouses. The condominium market is very active, but of course it's a much lower price point. Buyer origin, this is a question we get every year, is where are the buyers coming from? And there's a lot of media play on it. In the overall market, the international purchaser represents around 15 to 20% of our marketplace every year. Half of that comes from the United States. 80% of that comes from the state of Washington. The other big player is Hong Kong and Southeast Asia. I will say that if I refilter this and look at properties over $2 million and properties within 2 kilometers of the village, that number climbs to 25 or almost 30% are international buyers. The interesting thing about that to me is that when I looked at the American resorts, that's a very domestic experience. They don't have that percentage of international buyers in their communities. It tends to be a very American experience in the American resorts and a limited amount of international purchasing. Current situation, we're returning to historical levels of activity in our marketplace, which is somewhere between 500 and 650 transactions in Whistler, somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 transactions in Pemberton, probably 150 in Squamish, 150 in Pemberton. They are higher than they have been in the past due to population growth primarily. There in Whistler, there's a very strong interest in phase 1 condominiums and properties that can be rented. Let's call that the Airbnb impact. Generally speaking, the ability to rent properties is very attractive, and whether they do it with organized property management companies or whether they do it themselves, those types of properties are in very high demand at the current time. Commercially, you're looking at, in the village, I doubt you'd get into any lease space under $45 a foot today, and most of them are between 75 and 100 triple net. Outside of the village, 35 to 50. The industrial park is currently looking at 20 to 25, depending on space, location, and necessary amenities. Current median values, averages are higher due to the fact that we always every year have a couple of very high-end sales that pull those numbers up, so we've shown you median numbers here instead. And roughly speaking, the average transaction dollar per square foot is just over $1,000 a square foot pretty much anywhere in the valley at the current time. It goes as high as we had transactions as high as $2,400 a foot, but on average it's $1,000. Future expectations is, I think for land use anyways, is largely focused around the development of resident housing and affordable housing for the community and to support our businesses here. And of course there'll be some assessing of opportunities relative to the tourist experience and with stakeholders going forward as we finalize the OCP. So what am I saying? What do you want to take away from here? Sellers will sell and buyers will buy, but buyers set value. And I expect that if you're a seller, you're going to be on the market for a longer period of time, and you need to be fairly rigorous in how you establish your pricing. There is lots of buyer interest out there, but they are not, the real estate mania that was part of southwestern BC the last 3 years has probably disappeared for a number of the reasons that Helmut has raised. And I would expect that there will be more deliberation through negotiation, more assessment of value. I think from a buyer's perspective, you need to understand that a lot of our owners are pretty indifferent to short-term volatility in the marketplace. They don't have any particular urgency. They like their properties, and they have an idea in their head of what they're worth to them, both directly and indirectly or intangibly as part of their image of who they are. And it does help that if you're not using your own personal property, you can rent it out. So that covers a lot of the holding costs. So generally speaking, prices don't move down. And what we've seen, and I've seen over 3 of these cycles, is that people who sit on the sidelines waiting for a 15% correction in the marketplace tend to miss out on the opportunity in the property they like. And so if you do see something, and you should go for it, because in this community, we're not building any more of it. Likely a soft landing in value. Whistler in the major financial depression that Helmut talked about, the overall reduction in value in Whistler was about 10%. And that was the worst financial event in recent memory. So anything less than that, I doubt we'll see any kind of real movement in prices. It just means less houses will sell, is all it really means. And I think it's important to recognize that there's significant development going on south and north of us. I think that has impacts, obviously, for the highway, but it also has impacts on demand for labor, and it will have impacts on housing. Finally, Helmut's already mentioned some of the big picture items that could come out of the blue. Interest rates sound like they've been deferred for a while. And I should tell you that the only markets that are concerned about interest rates are Squamish and Pemberton. I've never had anybody tell me in Whistler that they're not buying because interest rates went up by 1/4 point. That's not a reason to not make a purchase, not in this marketplace anyways. Policy statements, obviously at the high end, some of the new taxes the provincial government has thrown at us do give people pause, and that will be factored into their idea of valuations. Construction costs in this community are very high, and they support values. Construction availability also drives up costs because there's just not as many contractors here as are sometimes needed. And then we have, of course, the macro policies that Helmut spoke to. One I do like to talk to a little bit is there is a perception in the marketplace that if Vancouver's bad, Whistler should be bad. And I really want to stress, we don't follow Vancouver particularly. Certainly there is a correlation, but because properties on the west side go down by $1 million in a month, as that market rationalizes, it doesn't mean that properties in Whistler are going to go down by $1 million. That's not going to happen. And if you get enough, the unfortunate part of that is if you get enough negative press, you get the psychology that everything should be the same. And as a wise man told me again today, every market is different. You cannot compare one market to another and with any amount of certainty. And you should look into each market's characteristics on your own and not assume that because something's happening in one place, it's happening somewhere else. And finally, the foreign buyer influence. Val certainly spoke to it. This is a place where people like to invest money. To the extent that we either encourage or discourage foreign investment into this province, will have an indirect effect, if not a direct effect, on real estate values and the real estate market in this community. That's it.
Okay, perfect, thank you.